The letter had arrived in Abilene on the 4th of March, 1882, smelling of dust and lye soap, and the particular loneliness of a man who had written it by lantern light, with hands more accustomed to bridle leather than pen and ink. Clara Dunhill had read it 7 times on the train from St. Louis, pressing the creased paper against her chest each time the car lurched, as if the words themselves were a living thing she might lose between the rails. Thomas Sutter had described his ranch in honest, unadorned strokes. 300 acres of open grassland east of the Cimarron, a house with 4 rooms and a porch that faced the sunset, a milk cow named Bess, who was gentle with strangers. He had described himself with equal plainness. 31 years old, brown hair going early to gray at the temples, a man who did not drink and who believed a wife deserved kindness above all other things. He had not described the cough that had been worsening since October, the blood he had begun finding on his pillow each morning, like small red flowers pressed into the cotton. He had not described the way his brother Caleb had begged him to see the doctor in Dodge City, or the way Thomas had refused, saying there was no point in a doctor telling him what the wind already whispered every time it passed through his chest. Clara did not know any of this when the stagecoach left her standing in the dust outside the land office in Cimarron with her single trunk and her single carpet bag and the letter folded into the pocket of her gray traveling dress. She knew only that she had come 1,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, and that the sky above her was so vast and so deeply blue it seemed to be the first honest sky she had ever stood beneath. She was 20 years old. She had buried her mother in January and her father's debts in February, and she had answered Thomas Sutter's advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch because it was the only door left open in a hallway of doors that had all been closing since she was 17. The land office clerk, a thin man with spectacles and an apologetic mouth, was the one who told her. He came out onto the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way men do when they are carrying news they wish belonged to someone else. Thomas Sutter had died 11 days ago. Pneumonia had taken him in the night, quick and quiet, the way winter takes the last leaves from a cottonwood, not with violence but with a kind of exhausted inevitability. He had been buried on his own land, beside the creek, beneath a wooden cross his brother had carved with a knife and steadied with river stones. Clara heard the words. She understood them the way one understands a sudden change in weather. Not with the mind, but with the body. A shift in pressure that makes the ears ring and the hands go cold. She stood very still. The wind moved her skirt against her legs. The dust settled on her shoes. She had $17 in her carpet bag, and no return ticket, and no home to return to even if she had possessed one. The clerk was still talking, something about the brother, something about arrangements, but Clara had stopped listening because the sky was pressing down on her now, that enormous blue weight, and she realized with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that she had arrived at the precise edge of the world, and there was nothing beyond it but open grass and the sound of her own breathing. She did not cry. She had used up her crying in St. Louis, spent it like currency on her mother's grave and her father's debts and the cold rented room where she had packed her trunk by candlelight. She simply stood and waited, because waiting was the only skill the world had left her, and she had become very good at it. The sound of hooves reached her before the rider did. A horse came up the main street at a walk, unhurried, a tall bay mare with dust on her flanks, and a man in the saddle who sat the way certain men sit a horse, not with arrogance, but with the unconscious ease of someone who has spent more of his life mounted than standing on his own 2 feet. He was younger than Thomas had described himself, or perhaps he only seemed younger because of the way grief had sharpened his face, paring it down to its essential architecture. Strong jaw, deep-set eyes the color of creek water in autumn, a mouth that looked as though it had recently forgotten how to smile. He wore no hat. His dark hair was uncombed. His shirt was wrinkled in the way of a man who had been sleeping in his clothes, or not sleeping at all. He pulled the mare to a stop in front of the land office and looked down at Clara, and she looked up at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke because the silence between them was already doing the work that words would only complicate. He swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the packed earth with a sound like a door closing. He was tall, taller than she had expected, though she had not known she was expecting anything. And when he stood before her, she could see the resemblance to the man in the letter, the ghost of Thomas in the line of his brother's shoulders, in the way his hands hung at his sides as if they were waiting for something useful to do. His voice, when it came, was low and rough-edged, a voice that had been scoured by wind and grief until only the essential grain remained. "You're Miss Dunhill." It was not a question. She nodded. He looked at her trunk, then at her carpet bag, then at her face. She watched him take in the gray dress, the dust on her hem, the careful way she held herself. Straight-backed, chin level, the posture of a woman who had learned that the world would take everything from you, but could not take the way you stood in it. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition, as if he understood without being told that she had nowhere else to go. "I'm Caleb," he said. "Thomas was my brother." "I know," she said, and her voice surprised her. Steady, clear, carrying no tremor despite the fact that the ground beneath her feet had dissolved, and she was standing on nothing but air and the stubborn refusal to fall. He reached down and picked up her trunk, as if it weighed nothing. He set it in the back of a wagon she had not noticed, hitched to a post behind the mare. Then he turned back to her and stood there, and she could see him wrestling with something. Not reluctance, not unkindness, but the particular difficulty of a man who knows what the right thing is and is trying to find the words to offer it without making it sound like charity. "The ranch is still there," he said. "The house is still there. Thomas wanted—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "He wrote to you because he wanted someone to share that life with. I can't be him. But the place needs tending, and you've come a long way, and I won't send you back to nothing." She studied his face. The late afternoon light caught the planes of it, turning his skin to amber, and she thought that he looked like a man who had been standing alone in a field for a very long time and had only just realized how tired he was. "Stay," he said. The word fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction, and the wind paused, as if it too wanted to hear her answer. Clara Dunhill looked at the vast sky, at the open road that led to nowhere she had ever been, at this stranger who was offering her not love, not marriage, not even companionship, but simply a roof and the absence of cruelty, which was more than the world had offered her in a very long time. She picked up her carpet bag and walked to the wagon and climbed onto the bench seat without assistance, because she had learned long ago that waiting for someone to help you up was a luxury she could not afford. Caleb watched her settle herself, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as if she had passed a test he had not known he was administering. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and they rode out of Cimarron without another word, the dust rising behind them like a veil being drawn across the life she was leaving and the life she was entering, and the prairie opened before them like a page that had not yet been written upon. The ranch house stood where Thomas had described it, facing west, its porch oriented toward the sunset, as if the man who built it had understood that the end of each day deserved to be witnessed. It was smaller than Clara had imagined. 4 rooms arranged in a simple cross, whitewashed walls gone gray with weather, a roof of cedar shingles that had been recently patched in places where the wind had lifted them. A barn stood 30 yards behind the house, its doors open to the evening air, and beyond it the land stretched out in every direction, grass and sky meeting at a seam so distant it seemed theoretical. Caleb carried her trunk inside and set it in the room that had been Thomas's. The bed neatly made, the pillow without its telltale stains, the nightstand holding a Bible and a tin cup and a daguerreotype of a woman Clara did not recognize. He had cleaned the room. She could smell the lye soap, could see the damp marks on the floorboards where he had scrubbed, and she understood that this small act of preparation, this erasure of his brother's dying, was the closest thing to tenderness Caleb Sutter knew how to offer. He stood in the doorway, filling it with his shoulders, and gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. "There's bread, salt pork, coffee if you want it." She nodded, but did not move. He lingered a moment longer, then retreated, his boots heavy on the plank floor, and she heard the front door open and close and his footsteps crossing the porch and descending the steps and moving away toward the barn, where she supposed he would sleep, giving her the house the way a man gives ground to a river, not out of weakness, but out of respect for a force he does not fully understand. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was stuffed with prairie grass and corn husks, and it crinkled beneath her weight with a sound like whispered conversation. She placed her hands flat on the quilt, a double wedding ring pattern stitched in faded blues and yellows, and she pressed down as if testing the reality of the surface beneath her. The room smelled of soap and cedar and the ghost of illness, and the evening light came through the single window in a shaft of amber that fell across the floor like a benediction. She did not unpack. She did not eat. She sat in the silence of a dead man's room and listened to the house settle around her. The creak of wood cooling in the evening air, the distant lowing of the milk cow, the wind moving through the grass outside with a sound like breathing, as if the land itself were alive and aware of her presence, and had not yet decided what to make of her. In the morning, she found coffee already made, a tin pot sitting on the stove with a cloth wrapped around the handle to keep it warm. A plate beside it held 2 biscuits and a jar of honey with a wooden dipper. Caleb was nowhere in the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see him in the corral, working a fence post back into the ground with a mallet, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his movements methodical and unhurried. The rhythm of a man who has learned to pour his grief into labor because he does not know where else to put it. She poured the coffee and drank it standing at the window, watching him. He did not look toward the house. He gave her the morning the way he had given her the house, completely, without intrusion, asking nothing in return. This became the pattern of their first days. He rose before dawn and left coffee and food. She rose after and found it waiting. He worked the land, mending fences, splitting wood, tending the small herd of cattle that grazed the eastern pasture, and she moved through the house like a ghost, learning to inhabit a new body, opening drawers, touching surfaces, reading the domestic archaeology of a life that had been interrupted. Thomas's clothes still hung on pegs in the hallway. His razor sat on a shelf above the wash basin. His boots stood beside the door, toes pointed outward, as if he might return at any moment and step into them and walk out into the morning. She did not move these things. She moved around them the way water moves around stones, and Caleb did not ask her to do otherwise. They ate supper together on the 3rd evening, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with a lantern between them and plates of salt pork and beans and the silence that had become their shared language. She noticed that he ate slowly, deliberately, as if the act of sitting at a table with another person required concentration. His hands were large and rough-knuckled, scarred across the backs from wire and wood and the hundred small violences of ranch work, and he held his fork with a careful precision that seemed at odds with their size, as if he were always conscious of how much damage they could do, and was determined to do none. He did not ask her about St. Louis. He did not ask her about her mother or her father or the life she had left behind. He asked her if she needed another blanket, if the coffee was strong enough, if the chimney in her room drew properly. Practical questions. Questions that required only practical answers. And she answered them. Yes, the blanket would be welcome, the coffee was fine, the chimney drew well, and these small exchanges accumulated like snowfall, each one negligible alone, but together building something that had weight and shape and the beginnings of warmth. On the fifth morning, she found him standing at the corral fence, staring at the milk cow with an expression she had not seen before. Not grief, not exhaustion, but worry. Bess stood in the corner of the corral with her head lowered, her breathing labored, her flank distended in a way that spoke of trouble. Clara crossed the yard without thinking, drawn by the animal's distress the way a compass needle is drawn north. Not by choice, but by nature. By the deep magnetic pull of a gift she had carried since childhood and had learned to hide because the world did not trust women who knew things they had not been taught. She climbed the fence rail and dropped into the corral and walked to the cow with her hand extended, palm up, fingers loose, the way her mother had taught her to approach any suffering creature. Slowly, openly, offering yourself as a question rather than an answer. Bess lifted her head and regarded Clara with one large brown eye, liquid and afraid, and Clara placed her hand on the cow's neck and felt the heat radiating through the hide, the rapid pulse beneath her fingers, the particular tremor that told her what she needed to know. She turned to Caleb, who was watching from the fence with his arms folded and his brow furrowed, and she spoke more words to him at once than she had spoken in the 5 days since her arrival. She's got a calf turned wrong inside her. If we don't help her now, we'll lose them both. He stared at her, not with disbelief. She could see that he recognized the certainty in her voice, the authority of someone who was not guessing but knowing, but with the particular stillness of a man recalibrating his understanding of the person standing before him. "You've done this before," he said. "My mother was a midwife, for women and animals both. She said the body knows what it needs. You just have to listen." He climbed the fence and landed beside her, and for the next hour they worked together in the dust and the heat, Clara's hands inside the cow, guiding the calf, turning it with a patience and precision that made Caleb's breath catch in his throat. She spoke to the animal in a low, steady murmur. Not words exactly, but sounds, a kind of music that seemed to reach past the cow's pain and into some deeper place where trust lived. Her sleeves were pushed above her elbows, her gray dress stained with blood and fluid, her hair falling loose from its pins, and she had never looked less like the pale, silent woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Cimarron and never looked more like herself. The calf came into the world wet and trembling and alive, and Bess turned and began to clean it with her tongue, and Clara sat back on her heels in the dust with her hands on her knees and her eyes closed, breathing, and Caleb Sutter looked at her and felt something shift inside his chest. A door opening that he had nailed shut 2 years ago when his wife Sarah had died in this same kind of labor, in this same kind of dust, with no one who knew how to help her. He had not told Clara about Sarah. He had not told anyone about Sarah. He had buried her beside the creek and built a cross and placed river stones around it And then he had walked into the house and closed every door and window and sat in the dark for 3 days. And when he emerged, he was a man made of function and silence, a man who could mend fences and split wood and feed cattle, but could not sit at a table with another human being without feeling the absence like a wound in the air. Now he watched Clara open her eyes and look at the calf and smile, the first smile he had seen from her, small and tired and radiant. And he felt the wound in the air begin to close, not with healing, but with the presence of someone who understood wounds, who carried her own, who did not need his to be explained or excused or fixed, but simply acknowledged, the way you acknowledge a scar by not looking away from it. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out rough, almost broken, carrying more weight than 2 syllables should be able to bear. She looked up at him, and her eyes, gray-green, the color of sage after rain, held his for a long moment, and she nodded. And that was enough. In the days that followed, her gifts continued to reveal themselves, each one arriving like a chapter in a book he had not known he was reading. She knew herbs, knew which ones grew wild along the creek bank and what they were for. She gathered yarrow and comfrey and dried them on the porch rail, and when Caleb cut his hand on barbed wire, she made a poultice that drew the heat from the wound overnight and left it clean and closing by morning. She knew weather, could read the sky the way he read cattle tracks, with a fluency that seemed instinctive rather than learned. On the 7th day, she told him to move the herd to the high pasture, and he did. And that night, a flash flood tore through the low ground where they had been grazing, and he stood on the porch and watched the water roar past in the darkness and thought of her standing in the kitchen that afternoon, her hand on the windowsill, her eyes on the horizon, reading something in the clouds that he could not see. She found the lost Henderson boy. The child had wandered from his family's homestead 3 miles east, and the father had ridden to Caleb's ranch in a panic, hat in hand, voice shaking. Clara had listened from the doorway, then walked to the barn and saddled the mare and ridden out without a word. And 2 hours later she returned with the boy asleep against her chest, his small fists clutching her dress, his cheeks streaked with dried tears. She had found him in a ravine, she said, by following the mockingbirds. Because mockingbirds always gather where there is crying. Caleb did not know if this was true. He suspected it was not true in any way that could be verified or explained. But the boy was found, and the father wept with gratitude, and Clara stood in the yard with dust on her hem and the evening light turning her hair to copper, and Caleb understood that the woman who had arrived as his dead brother's mail-order bride was not the woman he had assumed her to be. She was something else entirely, something the prairie recognized, even if the people on it did not, something old and quiet and necessary, like water, like wind, like the deep root systems that held the grassland together beneath the surface where no one thought to look. The fire had burned low on the 9th night when she finally spoke about St. Louis. They were sitting on the porch, he in the cane-backed chair that had been Thomas's, she on the top step with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, her face turned toward the darkness where the creek murmured its endless, unhurried conversation with the stones. The stars were thick above them, scattered across the black like salt spilled on a dark table, and the air smelled of cooling grass and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of a prairie night in early spring, when the earth is warming and everything buried is beginning to stir. She did not begin at the beginning. She began in the middle, the way people do when they have carried a story so long that the chronology has collapsed and only the essential images remain. Bright, sharp, disconnected, like shards of a broken mirror that still reflect the truth even though the whole picture is gone. Her mother had been a healer, not a doctor. Women were not doctors in the world Clara had grown up in, but something older and less official. A woman who knew plants and bodies and the invisible connections between them, who could place her hands on a swollen belly and know whether the child inside was turned wrong, who could brew a tea from willow bark and feverfew that would break a fever in hours. People came to her from all over the city, the poor, the desperate, the ones the doctors had given up on or never agreed to see in the first place. She worked from the kitchen of their small apartment on Mulberry Street, and Clara had grown up in the steam of boiling herbs, learning the names of plants the way other children learned the names of saints. Her father had been a clerk in a shipping office, a quiet man with gentle hands and a weakness for cards that he hid the way some men hide drinking, carefully, shamefully, with increasing desperation as the losses mounted. Clara did not blame him. She said this plainly, without bitterness, the way one states a fact about weather. He had been a good man carrying a sickness he could not name, and the sickness had eaten through their savings, and then through their furniture, and then through the walls of their life, until there was nothing left but debt and the cold, rented room where her mother had finally died. Not of any illness Clara could name, but of exhaustion, of depletion, of having given everything she had to everyone who needed it until there was nothing left for herself. Clara's voice was steady as she told this, but her hands tightened on her knees, and Caleb could see the whiteness of her knuckles in the starlight. Her father had died 2 weeks after her mother, walked into the Mississippi River on a January morning and did not walk out. The debts had passed to Clara like an inheritance in reverse, a negative legacy that consumed everything she owned and left her standing in an empty room with a newspaper open to the advertisements, reading the words of a man in Kansas who wanted a wife and offered kindness. And she had thought, kindness. When was the last time anyone offered me that? She stopped talking. The creek filled the silence. An owl called from somewhere in the cottonwoods along the water, a low, questioning sound, and the darkness around them seemed to draw closer, not threatening but attentive, as if the night itself were listening and had found her story worthy of its attention. Caleb sat in Thomas's chair and felt the weight of her words settle into him, the way rain settles into dry ground, slowly, deeply, reaching places that had not been touched in a very long time. He understood now why she had come. Not for love. She had not expected love. Not for escape. Escape implies a destination, and she had had none. She had come for the simple, radical promise of a life where someone would not take from her, where the transaction was honest, where the terms were stated plainly and held to. And Thomas, his brother, his good and decent and dying brother, had offered exactly that. And then he had died, and the promise had died with him, and she had arrived to find nothing but dust and a stranger and the vast, indifferent sky. Except the stranger had said stay, and she had stayed. And now they were sitting on a porch under stars, and she had told him the truth of her life, and he owed her the same. He knew this. He felt it the way he felt a change in weather, in his bones, in the tightening of his chest, in the way his hands gripped the arms of the chair, as if the chair were the only thing keeping him from falling into the story he had never told anyone. Sarah. He said her name aloud for the first time in 2 years, and it came out like a sound the earth makes when it shifts. Low, involuntary, carrying the weight of everything buried beneath it. Sarah had been his wife. They had married young. He was 22, she was 19, and they had built this ranch together, cut the timber and raised the walls and dug the well and planted the garden And for 3 years they had lived in the kind of happiness that is so quiet and so complete that you do not recognize it as happiness until it is gone. She had become pregnant in the spring of their 3rd year, and the pregnancy had been difficult from the start. She was small, the baby was large, and the nearest doctor was 40 miles away in Dodge City, and Caleb had meant to ride for him when the time came, had planned it, had mapped the route, had kept a horse saddled and ready in the barn for the last month. But the baby came early. It came in the night, in a storm, with rain turning the roads to rivers and the wind tearing shingles from the roof. And Sarah had labored for 14 hours while Caleb held her hands and told her it would be all right. And he had not known what to do, had not known how to help, had not known that the baby was turned wrong inside her. And by the time the storm broke and he could ride for help, it was too late. He had lost them both, Sarah and the child. A daughter, he thought, though he had never been certain because the midwife from town who came the next day had wrapped the tiny body without showing him, and he had not asked, because asking would have made it real in a way he could not survive. He buried them beside the creek. He carved the crosses. He placed the stones, and then he had walked into the house and closed every door and window and sat in the dark. And when he came out 3 days later, he was someone else. Someone who could function but not feel, who could work but not rest, who could speak but not say anything that mattered. Clara listened without moving. She did not reach for him. She did not offer comfort or platitude or the well-meaning cruelty of telling him it was not his fault. She simply sat on the step with her arms around her knees and her face turned toward him in the darkness. And she received his pain the way the earth receives rain, without judgment, without resistance, with the quiet understanding that some things must fall before they can be absorbed. When he finished, the silence returned, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of strangers sharing a space, but the silence of two people who have shown each other the worst thing that ever happened to them and have not looked away. The fire had gone to embers. The stars had shifted overhead. The owl had stopped calling, as if it too understood that this moment required stillness. Clara unfolded her arms and placed her hands flat on the porch step beside her. And Caleb looked at her hands, small, capable, stained with herb work and calf birth, and the honest labor of a woman who had never been given anything she did not earn. And he thought that he had never seen anything so brave as those hands, open and resting, asking for nothing, offering everything. The morning after the telling, the air between them had changed. Not dramatically. There was no sudden warmth, no rush of intimacy, no collapse of the careful distance they had maintained. But the quality of the silence shifted, the way light shifts when a cloud passes, and the same landscape is suddenly rendered in different tones. Where before their silence had been the silence of strangers, polite, cautious, full of the unspoken, it was now the silence of people who have said the hardest things and found that the world did not end, that the floor held, that the other person was still there in the morning. Caleb left coffee and biscuits as he always did, but this morning there was also a small jar of blackberry preserves he had been saving, set beside her plate with no note and no explanation, and when Clara found it, she held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. And the amber light through the kitchen window caught the dark fruit through the glass and made it glow like something precious, like a jewel pulled from the earth. And she understood that this was his language. Not words, but offerings. Small, practical gifts that said what his mouth could not. She ate the preserves on the biscuit and tasted sweetness and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. That afternoon, she walked to the creek. She had been there before to wash clothes, to fill the water bucket, but she had always skirted the two wooden crosses that stood beneath the cottonwood, giving them the wide berth that the living give to the dead out of respect or fear or the superstitious belief that grief is contagious. Today she walked directly to them. She knelt in the grass beside the smaller cross, the one without a name, because Caleb had not known what name to carve, and she placed her hand on the wood the way she had placed her hand on the milk cow's neck, with the gentle authority of someone who understands that touch is a form of speech and that the dead can hear it if you mean it. She stayed there for a long time. The creek moved past her, carrying its cargo of light and sound, and the cottonwood leaves turned and flashed silver in the breeze, and a meadowlark sang from the fence post nearest the water, its song so bright and liquid it seemed to be the voice of the creek itself, translated into music. When she rose, her knees were damp with dew, and there were grass stains on her gray dress, and she walked back to the house with a feeling she could not name. Not peace exactly, but something adjacent to peace, something that lived in the same territory. She had acknowledged them. She had placed her hand on the wood and said, without words, "I am here now. I am living in your house. I am eating from your table. I will not pretend you were not here first." That evening she cooked supper for the first time. She had found flour and lard and a sack of dried beans in the pantry, and she made biscuits and bean soup with wild onions she had gathered from the creek bank. And when Caleb came in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway and stood there, and the smell of cooking food filled the house, the way light fills a room when you open the curtains. Suddenly, completely, transforming everything it touched. They ate together. He complimented the biscuits, and she told him the wild onions would be better in another week when they had had more rain, and he said the rain would come Thursday, and she said no, Wednesday. And he looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them. Not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one, the possibility of one. A warmth at the corners of their mouths that acknowledged the small absurdity of two broken people arguing about weather over bean soup in a dead man's kitchen. After supper, he did not retreat to the barn. He sat on the porch in Thomas's chair, and she sat on the step, and they watched the sun go down in silence, and the sky turned colors that had no names in English. The deep rose gold of the horizon bleeding upward into lavender and then into the depthless blue-black of the coming night, and the first stars appeared like pinpricks in a dark cloth held up to a distant fire. She told him about the herbs she had found along the creek, the yarrow, the comfrey, the wild chamomile that grew in the shade of the cottonwoods. She told him she could make a salve for the wire cuts on his hands, and a tea for the headaches she had noticed he got in the late afternoon when the sun was at its worst. He listened with his head tilted slightly, the way a man listens to music in a language he does not speak, but finds beautiful nonetheless. She told him about her mother's garden in Street, Lewis, the small plot behind the apartment building where she had grown herbs in wooden boxes, defying the soot and the shade and the landlord who complained about the smell. She told him how her mother had taught her to listen to plants the way you listen to people, not to the words, but to the silences between them, the way a leaf curls when it needs water, the way a stem bends toward light, the way roots reach for each other underground in networks of mutual sustenance that no one sees but everyone depends upon. Caleb listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions that would redirect the conversation toward himself. He simply received her words the way the porch received the evening, openly, without resistance, with the quiet structural support that allows beautiful things to rest upon it. When she paused, he said, "Thomas would have liked you." The words hung in the air between them, and she felt their weight, not heavy but substantial, like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. She understood what he was really saying, that his brother had chosen well, that the letter Thomas had written by lantern light had reached the right person even if it had not reached her in time, that the promise of kindness Thomas had made was being kept, in a different form, by a different man, but kept nonetheless. "I think I would have liked him," she said, and Caleb nodded, and the darkness settled around them like a quilt, and the creek sang its endless song, and somewhere in the cottonwoods the owl called again, not questioning this time, but answering, as if it had heard something in the night that satisfied it, some sound or signal that told it the world was, for this moment at least, arranged as it should be. The riders came on the 12th day. Clara saw them first. 3 figures on horseback, moving across the eastern pasture in a line, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky like notes written on a staff of pale blue. She was standing at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, and she watched them approach with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned to read danger the way she reads weather. In the distance, in the quality of the light, in the way the horses moved with the rigid purpose of men who have already decided what they have come to do. She set the cup down and walked to the porch. Caleb was in the barn. She could hear the rhythmic sound of his hammer against a hinge he had been repairing since dawn, steady and unhurried, the cadence of a man who did not yet know that the morning had changed. The riders reached the yard and stopped. The man in front was broad-shouldered and thick-necked, wearing a town marshal's star pinned to a vest that strained across his belly. Beside him sat a thin man in a black coat, whom Clara recognized as the land office clerk, his spectacles catching the light, his apologetic mouth compressed into something harder and less forgiving than the expression he had worn when he told her Thomas was dead. The third rider was a woman, tall, angular, her face shadowed beneath a bonnet that she wore like armor, her back straight with the particular rigidity of someone who has appointed herself the moral authority of a community and intends to exercise that authority fully. Clara knew this woman's type. She had known her in St. Louis, in the church committees that had refused her mother's help and then whispered about her remedies as witchcraft, in the landlord's wife who had complained about the herbs, in every woman who had ever looked at Clara's mother and seen not a healer but a threat to the orderly world she had constructed from fear and scripture and the absolute certainty that she alone knew how God intended people to live. The marshal spoke first. His voice carried the false authority of a man who is uncomfortable with confrontation and compensates by speaking louder than necessary. "Miss Dunhill, we've come from town on a matter of community concern." Clara said nothing. She stood on the porch with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and waited. The woman in the bonnet leaned forward in her saddle. "It has come to the attention of the Women's Christian Temperance Committee that you are living unchaperoned with an unmarried man on this property. This arrangement is immoral, irregular, and an offense to the standards of decency that this community has established and intends to maintain." The clerk shifted in his saddle, his eyes on the ground. The marshal cleared his throat. The woman continued, her voice rising with the momentum of rehearsed conviction. "Furthermore, we have received reports of your activities, the herbs, the so-called healing, the manner in which you handled the Henderson boys' disappearance. These are not the behaviors of a Christian woman. They are the behaviors of someone whose influence on this community we cannot in good conscience permit to continue." Clara felt the words land against her like stones, not because they were true. She knew they were not true, but because they were familiar. because she had heard their echo in every room her mother had ever been driven from. Because the world had an endless supply of these words and an endless willingness to use them against women who knew things they were not supposed to know. The barn door opened. Caleb walked into the yard with the hammer still in his hand, and he stopped when he saw the riders, and something in his posture changed. Not aggression, not threat, but a kind of settling. The way a tree settles its roots deeper into the earth when it feels the wind begin to rise. He looked at the marshal. He looked at the woman in the bonnet. He looked at the clerk, who would not meet his eyes. Then he walked to the porch and stood beside Clara. Not in front of her, beside her. And the hammer hung at his side like a thing forgotten. And his voice when he spoke was quiet and level and carried the moral weight of a man who has lost everything and therefore has nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. This woman came 1,000 miles on a promise my brother made. She arrived to find him dead and buried, and not a soul in this territory who owed her a single kindness. She stayed because I asked her to. She has delivered a calf that would have died. She has healed my hands with medicine she made from the creek bank. She found the Henderson boy when none of you could. She has done nothing but good since she set foot on this land, and I will not send her away because her goodness makes you uncomfortable. The silence that followed was the silence of people recalculating. The marshal looked at the woman in the bonnet. The woman in the bonnet looked at the clerk. The clerk looked at the ground. The wind moved through the grass, and the grass bent and straightened, and the sky above them was enormous and indifferent and blue. The marshal gathered his reins. "We'll be watching, Sutter," he said, and the words were meant to sound like authority, but they sounded like retreat. And the 3 riders turned their horses and rode back across the pasture in a line, their silhouettes shrinking against the sky until they were gone. Clara stood on the porch and watched them disappear, and she felt Caleb's presence beside her, solid, warm, unwavering. And she understood that something had been declared, something that could not be undeclared, and that the riders would return because people like that always returned, and that the next time they came, they would bring more than words. The wedding veil had been her mother's. Clara had carried it folded at the bottom of her trunk, beneath the practical dresses and the herb journal and the single pair of good shoes she had brought from St. Louis. Not because she had expected to wear it, but because it was the last thing her mother had touched before she died. A length of ivory lace, yellowed with age, delicate as breath, tatted by hand by Clara's grandmother in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania before the war. It had been worn by 3 generations of women in her family, each of whom had stood before a man and made promises that the world would test with varying degrees of cruelty, and it had survived all of them. The wearing and the washing and the folding and the carrying. And now it lay in Clara's hands in the amber light of the kitchen on the morning of the 14th day. And she held it the way you hold something that is both fragile and indestructible, something that carries the weight of every woman who has ever touched it. She had not planned to take it out. She had opened the trunk to find her herb journal, and the lace had been there beneath it, and her hands had found it before her mind could intervene. And now she sat at the kitchen table with the veil spread across her lap, and the morning light moving through it, illuminating the pattern, flowers and vines and small birds with outstretched wings, each one stitched with a patience that seemed impossible, a devotion to beauty that defied the hardness of the world in which it had been made. Caleb found her there. He came in for coffee and stopped in the doorway, and she looked up at him with the lace in her hands, and neither of them spoke, and the silence between them held everything that needed to be said. That she had come here to be a bride, that the groom had died, that she was holding the veil she had carried for a wedding that would never happen, and that the light was moving through the lace and casting shadows on the table that looked like flowers blooming on bare wood. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. He reached out and touched the edge of the lace with one rough finger, tracing the line of a vine, and his touch was so gentle it seemed impossible that the same hand had swung a hammer and mended wire and gripped a fence post against the pull of the wind. "Your mother's," he said. She nodded. He withdrew his hand and placed it flat on the table, and she could see the cuts she had healed, the new skin pink and tender beneath the calluses, and she thought that his hands were a map of everything he had survived, and everything he had built, and everything he had lost, and that she could read them the way she read plants and weather and the turning of calves inside their mothers, with a knowledge that lived in her body rather than her mind. She folded the veil carefully, pressing the creases flat with her palms, and she placed it on the table between them like an offering, like a question, like a bridge built from lace and light across the distance that still separated them. He looked at the folded veil. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the thing he could not say, that he wanted her to stay not because the ranch needed tending, not because his brother had made a promise, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had walked into his life carrying herbs and silence and a courage he did not fully understand, and she had placed her hand on his dead daughter's cross and knelt in the grass and stayed there until the meadowlark sang, and he had watched her from the barn door and felt something crack open inside him that he had believed was sealed forever. She placed her hand on the table beside the veil, not on his hand, beside it, close enough to touch, but not touching, the distance between them no wider than a breath. And in that distance lived everything they had told each other by the fire, and everything they had not yet said, and everything they would say in time, when the words were ready, when the silence had done its work, and the language that grew from it was strong enough to bear the weight of what they meant. The veil lay between their hands like a promise waiting to be spoken. The morning after the veil, Clara walked to the creek and picked wildflowers, black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers, and the small white blossoms of yarrow that grew in clusters along the bank, like constellations fallen to earth. She carried them back to the house in the crook of her arm and placed them in a tin cup on the kitchen table. And when Caleb came in for supper that evening, the flowers were there between the plates, and the kitchen smelled of bean soup and wild onion, and the sweet green scent of living things brought indoors. And he stood in the doorway and looked at the flowers, and then at Clara, and then at the flowers again, and his throat worked as if he were trying to swallow something that would not go down. They ate in the quiet that had become their communion. The soup was good. The biscuits were better than the last batch, because she had found a way to make the oven draw more evenly by adjusting the flue. And she told him this, and he nodded, and she told him about the stand of wild mint she had found upstream that would make a tea good for digestion. And he nodded again, and then he set down his spoon and looked at her across the table with the flowers between them and the lamplight turning everything to gold. Clara. Her name in his mouth was a new sound in the world. He had not spoken it before, had called her Miss Dunhill, or nothing at all, had referred to her in the third person when speaking to the marshal as this woman, as if naming her would cross a boundary he was not ready to cross. But now he said it, Clara, and the two syllables fell into the room like stones into still water, and the ripples moved outward through the lamplight, and the steam from the soup and the scent of the flowers, and she felt them reach her and pass through her and continue outward into the darkness beyond the walls, carrying something that had no name, but that she recognized the way she recognized the turning of weather and the needs of plants and the sound of a calf's first breath. She looked at him. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, and they held hers with a steadiness that was not demand but invitation. An open door, a lit window, a porch facing west toward the sunset, waiting. "Caleb," she said. His name in her mouth was an answer, not to a question he had asked aloud, but to the question his eyes had been asking, since the day she climbed onto the wagon bench in Cimarron, without assistance, and he had watched her and known, in some wordless place beneath thought, that she was not what he had expected and was exactly what he needed. He reached across the table. His hand came to rest beside hers, not on it, beside it, in the same gesture she had made the morning of the veil, the same breath-wide distance, the same trembling, almost touch that was more intimate than any embrace because it was chosen, deliberate, a conscious decision to close the distance by exactly this much and no more, to honor the space between them even as they acknowledged that the space was shrinking. Then she moved her hand. She placed it on his. Her fingers settled over his scarred knuckles with the same gentle authority she had used to calm the milk cow and guide the turning calf and press the poultice into his wounded palm. And the warmth of her skin against his was the warmth of the first day of spring when the earth remembers that it is alive. And Caleb Sutter closed his eyes and felt something break open inside him that was not grief but its opposite. Not joy exactly, but the space where joy would grow, the cleared ground, the turned soil, the first green shoot of something that had been buried so long he had forgotten it was there. The flowers stood between them in their tin cup, trembling slightly in the draught from the window, and the lamplight held them all in its amber embrace. The man, the woman, the flowers, the table, the house that a dead man had built for a life he would not live. And outside the creek sang and the stars appeared one by one like witnesses taking their places. And the prairie settled into its vast and ancient silence. And the night held them the way the earth holds seeds, gently, firmly, with the patient certainty that what is planted in darkness will eventually rise toward light. The riders came back on a Tuesday, and this time there were 7 of them. Clara saw the dust before she saw the horses, a brown smudge on the eastern horizon that grew and darkened and resolved into shapes, and she knew before she counted them that there were more than 3, and she knew before she saw the marshal's star that this was not a conversation but a confrontation. Caleb was in the south pasture checking fence line. She could see him in the distance, a small figure against the grass, too far to call, too far to reach before the riders arrived. She walked into the house and took the rifle from above the door, Thomas's rifle, oiled and loaded, which Caleb had shown her on the 6th day without comment, simply lifting it from its pegs and placing it in her hands, and watching her check the chamber with the competence of a woman who had been taught to shoot by a father who believed daughters should know what sons knew. She did not intend to fire it. She intended to hold it. There was a difference, and the men who were riding toward her would understand that difference when they saw her standing on the porch with the stock against her shoulder and the barrel pointed at the ground and her gray-green eyes steady above the sight line. The marshal was in front again, but the woman in the bonnet was not with them. In her place rode men, ranchers, townsmen, one of them wearing a deputy's star that looked newly pinned, as if the authority it represented had been manufactured for this occasion. They pulled up in the yard, and the horses stamped and blew, and the dust settled around them like a judgment. The marshal's voice was harder this time, stripped of the false courtesy he had worn on his first visit. "Miss Dunhill, the town council has voted. Your presence on this property is a matter of public concern. You are to leave Cimarron County by week's end or face charges of vagrancy, moral turpitude, and unlawful cohabitation." Clara stood on the porch with the rifle and said nothing. She had learned from her mother that silence in the face of unjust authority is its own form of speech, louder than argument, more unsettling than defiance, because it refuses to participate in the terms the authority has set and forces it to confront the emptiness of its own position. The men shifted in their saddles. One of them, the deputy, young, nervous, his hand resting on his holster with the uncertain grip of someone who has never drawn a weapon in earnest, spoke up. "Ma'am, it'd be easier if you just came along quiet." The sound of hooves came from the south. Caleb rode in hard. The bay mare lathered and blowing, and he pulled her to a stop between the riders and the porch, and swung down and stood there, breathing hard, his eyes moving from face to face with the cold inventory of a man assessing a threat. He looked at Clara on the porch. He looked at the rifle in her hands. He looked at the marshal. "Get off my land." The marshal leaned forward. "Caleb, this isn't personal. The council—" "I said get off my land." His voice did not rise. It dropped, lower, quieter, denser, and the quality of it changed the air the way a drop in barometric pressure changes the air before a storm, and the horses felt it and shifted beneath their riders, and the young deputy's hand fell away from his holster as if the metal had burned him. The marshal held Caleb's gaze for a long moment. Then he gathered his reins and turned his horse, and the others followed, and they rode out of the yard in a loose group that was no longer a line, their formation broken by the encounter. And Caleb watched them go with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and the late afternoon light casting his shadow long across the dust. When they were gone, he climbed the porch steps and stood before Clara and looked at her holding the rifle, and she looked at him, and neither of them needed to say what they both knew, that the riders would return again, that next time they might bring paper with a judge's signature, that the law in this territory was a flexible instrument wielded by whoever held it, and that two people alone on 300 acres of open grassland were as vulnerable as any two creatures who had ever tried to make a stand against a world that did not want them. He took the rifle from her hands and placed it back above the door. Then he turned to her, and his face held something she had not seen before. Not fear, not anger, but resolve. The particular clarity of a man who has decided what he is willing to lose and what he is not. "We'll marry," he said. "Tomorrow, before they come back. A legal marriage they can't undo." She looked at him. The light through the doorway was amber, and it fell across his face and turned his eyes to gold, and she searched them for obligation, for duty, for the resigned practicality of a man making a strategic decision, and she found none of those things. She found instead the thing he had shown her when he touched the veil, when he said her name across the table, when he placed his hand beside hers and let the breath-wide distance speak for him. She found want, not desire, something deeper and more durable than desire. The want of a man who has been alone in a field for 2 years and has finally allowed himself to believe that he does not have to stay there. "Yes," she said. They married at sunrise on the porch that faced west, which meant they stood with their backs to the sunset's territory and their faces toward the east, toward the new light, toward the direction from which Clara had come, and from which all beginnings come, and the Reverend Hollis, a circuit preacher who owed Caleb a debt for a horse doctored through colic the previous winter, spoke the words with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the ceremony was not the point, that the point was the two people standing before him with their hands joined and their faces luminous in the early light. Clara wore her mother's veil. The ivory lace fell over her hair and across her shoulders and caught the dawn in its pattern of flowers and vines and small birds with outstretched wings. and the light moved through it and cast shadows on her skin that looked like blessings, like the visible evidence of every woman who had worn it before her. Her mother, her grandmother, the women whose names she carried in her blood and whose courage she wore on her body like a garment made of inherited strength. Caleb wore a clean shirt. He had washed it in the creek that morning, scrubbing it against the stones the way he scrubbed everything, thoroughly, methodically, with the focused attention of a man who understands that care is a form of love and that the small acts matter as much as the large ones. His hair was combed, his boots were brushed, his hands, scarred and rough and gentle, held hers with a steadiness that trembled only once. When he spoke her name in his vows, Clara, and the word broke open in his mouth like a seed breaks open in the earth, releasing something that had been waiting inside it for a very long time. She spoke his name in return, Caleb, and the creek heard it, and the cottonwoods heard it, and the two crosses beneath the trees heard it, Sarah and the unnamed daughter, and the wind carried it across the pasture and into the grass, and the grass received it and held it the way the earth holds everything that is given to it with love. The Reverend pronounced them married, and Caleb lifted the veil from Clara's face with both hands, carefully, reverently, the way you lift a cloth from something precious, and her face beneath it was bright with tears she had not known she was shedding. And he looked at her, and she looked at him, and the distance between them, the breath-wide distance that had been their language for 14 days, closed at last. He kissed her. It was not the kiss of passion or of hunger, but the kiss of arrival, the press of one mouth against another that says, I am here, I am staying, I have crossed the distance, and I will not go back. Her hands came up and rested on his chest, over his heart, and she could feel it beating beneath her palms, strong and steady and alive. And the rhythm of it was the rhythm of the ranch and the creek and the wind and the turning of the earth. And she understood that this was what her mother had meant when she said that healing was not about fixing what was broken, but about placing your hands on the wound and staying there until the body remembered its own wholeness. They stood on the porch in the new light, married, and the prairie stretched out around them in every direction, vast and golden and indifferent to the small human drama that had just unfolded on its surface, and yet not entirely indifferent, because the meadowlark sang from the fence post by the creek, and the wind gentled, and the clouds that had been building in the west dissolved as if they had reconsidered, and the sky opened above them in a blue so deep and so clear, it seemed to be the sky's own way of saying yes. The marriage was recorded in the county ledger that afternoon. Caleb rode to town alone and stood before the clerk and signed the paper and watched the clerk stamp it with the county seal. And the clerk, the thin man with the apologetic mouth, looked at the signature and then at Caleb and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The law was the law. Clara Dunhill was now Clara Sutter, and the arrangement that had scandalized the Women's Christian Temperance Committee was now a legal union sanctified by God and the territory of Kansas. And the riders who had come twice would have no grounds to come a third time, and the woman in the bonnet would have to find another target for her righteous fury. Caleb rode home in the late afternoon with the marriage certificate folded in his shirt pocket, and when he crested the rise above the ranch, he saw Clara standing in the garden she had begun to plant beside the house, a small plot of turned earth where herbs were already pushing up through the soil, green and tender and determined. And she looked up and saw him and raised her hand, and he raised his, and the distance between them was the distance of a homecoming, the sweet, familiar distance between a man and the place where he belongs. That night they sat on the porch together, and the fire in the pit crackled and sent sparks upward into the darkness like prayers released. And Clara leaned against Caleb's shoulder and felt the warmth of him through the clean shirt. And his arm came around her and rested there with the weight of something that had finally found its place. The veil hung inside on a peg by the door, next to Thomas's hat that neither of them had moved, and the two objects hung side by side in the lamplight, the dead man's hat and the living woman's veil, and they seemed to speak to each other in the silent language of things that have been worn and loved and carried through the world by hands that are no longer here, but whose touch remains, indelible, in the fabric. Months passed. The garden grew. The herbs Clara planted spread along the creek bank and up toward the house, and the air around the ranch took on the scent of lavender and mint and the sharp green fragrance of rosemary, and people began to come, quietly, cautiously, the way animals come to water. The rancher's wife with the colicky baby, the homesteader with the infected hand, the old Kiowa woman from the reservation who recognized in Clara something she had seen before in her own grandmother's, a kinship of knowledge that crossed every boundary the white world had drawn. Clara helped them all. She brewed teas and made poultices and placed her hands on swollen bellies and fevered foreheads. And the people who came to her left better than they arrived, and they told others, and the others came. And the ranch that had been a place of solitude and grief became a place of healing and gathering, and the woman in the bonnet could say nothing about it because Clara Sutter was a married woman on her own land doing nothing but good. The child came in October, when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned to gold, and the air was sharp with the first promise of winter. Clara labored through the night, and Caleb was beside her, and this time he knew what to do because Clara had taught him, had placed his hands on her belly in the weeks before and shown him how to feel the child's position, had told him what to watch for, had given him the knowledge that would have saved Sarah if anyone had thought to give it to him then. The baby was born at dawn, a girl, small and red-faced and furious with the indignity of arrival, and Caleb held her in his scarred hands and wept, openly, freely, without shame. And Clara watched him weep and knew that the tears were not only for this child, but for the other one, the daughter he had never held, the cross without a name beside the creek. They named her Eleanor, after Clara's mother. They called her Nell. She had Caleb's dark hair and Clara's gray-green eyes, and she slept in a cradle Caleb had built from cottonwood, and the cradle stood beside the bed in the room that had been Thomas's, and the daguerreotype of the woman Clara had never asked about still sat on the nightstand because some things do not need to be explained. They only need to be honored. On a morning in late November, with the first snow dusting the pasture, and Nell asleep in the cradle and the fire burning steady in the stove, Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched Caleb cross the yard toward the house. He moved slowly, unhurried, a man walking home. The light was silver, the particular silver of a winter morning on the prairie, clean and luminous and new, and it fell across his shoulders and across the yard and across the garden where the herbs slept beneath the snow, waiting for spring. And Clara placed her hand on the glass and felt the cold of it against her palm, and thought that love was not what she had imagined it to be when she was a girl reading novels in her mother's kitchen in St. Louis. It was not rescue. It was not passion. It was not the dramatic gesture or the whispered declaration or the moment when the music swells and the world rearranges itself around two people who have found each other. It was this: a man crossing a yard in winter light, a child sleeping in a cradle made of cottonwood, a garden buried under snow that would bloom again because the roots were deep and the soil was good, and someone had tended it with patience and with love. Caleb opened the door and stepped inside, bringing the cold air with him, and Nell stirred in her cradle, and Clara turned from the window, and the house held them all. The living and the memory of the dead, the grief and the joy, the silence and the sound of a child's breathing. And outside the creek, moved beneath its skin of ice, carrying its cargo of light and time toward the sea, patient and unhurried, knowing as it had always known that the water that falls as snow in winter will rise as flowers in spring, and that everything lost is held somewhere, waiting to be found by hands brave enough to reach for it.